The trail ended abruptly, a faint scar of tire tracks dissolving into a sea of sagebrush and silence. There was no signpost, just two splintered posts leaning against the wind, a ghost of a long-gone gate. A fine layer of yellow dust coated everything, and the sun hung in the sky like a weak, pale coin. It was the sort of place you didn't find by accident. You had to be truly lost to end up there. Jack Hollister didn't believe in getting lost, but he'd been tracking the wind for 3 days, and it had led him here. His roan horse, a strong but tired animal, plodded forward at his lead, her flanks slick with sweat. The leather of his saddle groaned with each step. A rifle was slung across his back, and his canteen swung a slow, rhythmic arc at his hip. He hadn't spoken a word since leaving the last settlement, not even to his horse. There had been no one to talk to. But then he heard the sound. It was faint, a dry, rustling whimper, like a leaf caught in a draft. Jack froze, his hand tightening on the reins. He tilted his head, listening intently. A second whimper, followed by a fragile newborn cry, a sound out of place in this harsh land. He dismounted and tied his roan to a gnarled juniper tree. The air carried the scent of dry earth and old cedar, the smell of abandonment. He pushed through a thicket of scrub and broken boards and found her. A woman tied to a splintered post, her hands bound tightly behind her back. Her dress was ripped at the shoulder, and a thin trail of dried blood ran from her temple. Her face was half hidden by a curtain of matted, dark hair. Her eyes were wide, empty, and fixed on nothing at all. At her feet, wrapped in a tattered old blanket, were 2 tiny babies, twin girls, no more than a day or 2 old. One of them gnawed weakly on a corner of the cloth, while the other blinked slowly, as if the harsh world was already too much for her. Jack didn't say a word. He drew his hunting knife, and moved carefully, deliberately, cutting the rope binding her wrists. Her hands fell, limp as driftwood. She swayed, and Jack caught her before she hit the ground. She was shockingly light, a bundle of bones and fear. He looked down the hill toward an old, dilapidated cabin, its roof caved in. A wisp of smoke still drifted from the chimney. A final breath. The ropes were too new. They'd left recently. Jack first gathered the infants, carefully wrapping them in his saddle blanket and slinging them across his chest. Then he lifted the woman, his arms supporting her back and knees, and carried her like a fragile burden toward his horse. "You comin' with me," he said, his voice low and firm, a statement of fact, not a question. She didn't respond. The ride back was slow. He walked the horse to avoid jostling the infants. The woman's head lolled against his chest, and he tightened the blanket around her. A few lazy snowflakes began to fall, settling on his hair and coat collar. By the time they reached his cabin, the sky had turned a bruised shade of purple. The cabin was a single-room affair with a small iron stove in the corner, and a cot by the window. Jack kicked the door open and carried her inside. The warmth was a physical presence, a gentle embrace. The babies whimpered, their tiny fists flailing. They were hungry. With practiced ease, Jack laid the woman on his cot and checked for injuries. He found more bruises than cuts. Her ankles were raw where the rope had dug in, and one eye was already swelling. Her dress was torn near the bodice, but he looked away, covering her with a thick quilt. He built the fire up, set water to boil, and poured the last of his milk into 2 small jars. He mixed it with some rainwater, and warmed it. The twins drank greedily, their tiny mouths working furiously, their eyes fluttering shut. Only when they were asleep did Jack sit back. He didn't sleep that night. He sat by the fire, watching her chest rise and fall. He didn't know her name or her story, but it didn't matter. Not yet. He remembered the look on her face when he found her. It wasn't fear or shame, but a deep, weary surrender, as if she had stopped expecting to be saved long ago. In the soft light of dawn she stirred, a small groan escaping her lips. She turned her head toward the cradle where the twins were sleeping, swaddled in his old shirts. Her eyes opened, and she looked at him. He was still in his travel-worn clothes, his hair damp from the snow. She took in the room slowly, as if she'd woken up in a different world. "You didn't leave us," she whispered, her voice a dry rasp. He shook his head. She tried to sit up, wincing. "They said I was useless, a mouth they couldn't afford to feed. Said girls bring no dowry, that I should have died in childbirth." Jack didn't reply. He dipped a cloth in warm water and offered it to her. She took it with trembling fingers and dabbed her cheek. Then she looked at him, her eyes searching. "Aren't you afraid of what people will say? Taking in a woman like me, with 2 daughters and no husband?" Jack tilted his head slightly. "You're safe. That's all that matters to me." A flicker of something. Disbelief, relief, a fragile hope passed across her face. She didn't cry. He simply stood, stoked the fire and laid out some bread on a tin plate. She watched him move with a quiet, efficient grace, like a man who was used to being alone but hadn't let it make him cold. His silence wasn't harsh. It was a peaceful, gentle presence, like the quiet between snowflakes. Outside, a lone crow called and then flew off. Inside, the babies stirred. "My name is Ilara," she said, her voice thin but steady. She looked at the fire, not him. "I don't know how to thank you, mister." He looked away as he answered. "Jack, just Jack. No last name, no history." The quiet settled between them. Then the wind shifted, sending a fresh flurry of snow against the cabin windows. Ilara leaned forward, the quilt pooled in her lap. "You should know," she said slowly. "My husband's family, they'll come looking. They won't be happy you took me." Jack didn't turn. "I don't much care what men like that think." The fire popped, sending a shower of sparks into the air. She watched him, studying him as if he were a puzzle she couldn't solve. And then, so quietly it was almost lost in the wind's low sigh, she said, "Then I think I'm safe here." Jack's shoulders loosened slightly. Later that night, as she fed the twins by the firelight, he stepped outside. Thin sheets of snow brushed his face, settling on his collar. The sky was vast and empty above the pines. And for the first time in years, Jack felt it. Not joy, not hope, just a flicker of purpose. He looked back at the warm light spilling from the cabin window. She was still there. The girls were still breathing. And maybe, just maybe, this lonesome road wasn't ending after all. Maybe it was just beginning a new turn. The fire never went out. Not once in the 6 days since Jack brought them in. He would rise before the sun to add fresh wood to the embers and tend to them at dusk. He fed the fire between chores without being asked. Ilara noticed, even though he never mentioned it. She also noticed how he always stepped outside whenever she needed to undress the babies, giving her a sense of privacy. The silence between them wasn't awkward. It was a deliberate space, as if too many words might shatter the fragile peace they had built. By the end of the first week, Ilara could walk without swaying. The bruises on her neck were fading from purple to a sallow yellow. Her wrists, once raw and burned, now bent without pain. She wore Jack's spare flannel shirt, the sleeves rolled up, and a skirt she'd stitched together from 2 old pillowcases. It didn't fit right, but she never complained. Her voice when she spoke was always careful, as if she were afraid of using too much air. The twins, whom she'd named her little sparrows, were sleeping more soundly. Jack had carved 2 small wooden rattles out of pine scraps without telling her. He left them on the windowsill one morning and said nothing. When Ilara found them, her hand hovered over the tiny carved flowers on the handles. Her mouth parted slightly, and she tucked them into the cradle, returning to her chores without a word. That was how they spoke in gestures. Each day Jack rode out before noon, returning by dark. He'd come back with firewood, supplies, and sometimes bits of cloth from the nearest town, Eagle's Rest. Ilara never asked what he did. She guessed ranch work or trading, but she wondered if he was deliberately keeping their presence quiet, protecting them from something. The town hadn't come calling, but a tense silence had a way of building like a storm. One morning she asked if he needed help with anything. He didn't answer right away, just gave her that long, steady look he reserved for things he wasn't sure how to handle. Then he handed her a bucket and nodded toward the well. She smiled for the first time in days. The weight of the bucket in her hands felt grounding. Her body was still weak, but her steps were steadier now. Outside, the air smelled of thawing snow and pine. Ravens flew low, their wings silent but heavy. Ilara filled the bucket, spilling a little water on her skirt, but she didn't mind. When she turned to head back, she saw Martha Caldwell standing near the road, her mule laden with sacks of grain. Martha was the kind of woman who believed her mere presence was a charitable offering. She had sharp eyes, a thin smile, and a bonnet she never took off. Her mule wore a bright red blanket with her initials stitched in. "Well, now," Martha said, eyeing the baby's swaddling cloths on the porch. "You look mighty well for a ghost." Alara tightened her grip on the bucket. "Is Jack inside?" Martha's voice dropped to a conspiratorial whisper. "People are talking, girl, about him keeping you here with 2 children and no name." Alara stared at her. "My name is Alara." Martha sniffed. "A name doesn't carry much weight when there's no ring on your finger, dear." She turned toward the cabin with a smirk. "Tell Jack the first brought more flour. He'll be needin' it, what with 3 mouths to feed now." Then she mounted her mule and rode off slowly, leaving the sting of shame burning in Alara's ears. Jack came out moments later, having seen the whole exchange from the window. He didn't speak, just took the bucket and carried it inside. That night, Alara sat long after the babies were asleep. She didn't sew or rock in the chair. She just stared into the fire while Jack fixed a loose hinge on the cabin door. Finally she spoke. "They'll never stop reminding me I don't belong." Jack didn't stop working. "You belong here." She shook her head. "Not here, not in this town, not in any town. They'll always see me as damaged goods." He paused, laying the hinge down gently on the table. "I don't answer to towns." Her hands curled into fists. "You don't know what it's like to be treated like something worthless because you gave birth to girls. Like you're a burden wrapped in skin, a mouth no one wants to feed." Jack stared at her. And then in the slowest, calmest voice, he said, "I know what it's like to be alone so long you stop hearing your own name." She looked up. "I know what it's like to have people point at your silence and call it wrong. To be looked at like a question no one wants to answer." The fire crackled. "I ain't never had to raise babies," he said, nodding toward the cradle. "But I know enough to see they're not curses." Alara's eyes burned. Jack reached into his coat pocket and slid something across the table toward her. It was a jar of sweet cream from town. "Heard you missed it," he said softly. She pressed her lips together, not crying, just nodding once, and taking the jar in both hands like it was a sacred offering. The next morning she found him outside, hammering in new posts along the fence line. Without a word she brought him water, then stayed to hand him nails. Side by side, in the cold wind they worked. He didn't speak, but she could feel something shift between them. Like the frayed rope tethering her soul to the world, had found a second, sturdier knot. One afternoon she found a book on the mantel, a small worn volume of poetry. Inside the cover, scrawled in faded ink, were the words, "For Jack, a gift from your father, so you'll always have a place to go when the quiet gets heavy." Alara turned a few pages. The verses were underlined, notes in the margins. The pages smelled of dust and cedar. Jack stepped in behind her. "I didn't know you read poetry," she said softly. "Only the lines that feel like songs," he replied. She smiled. That night, the wind picked up, and the twins wouldn't settle. One cried, until her voice cracked. "You without being asked." Jack scooped her up and paced the cabin slowly, whispering something Alara couldn't hear. Eventually, both girls slept again. When he turned to Alara, he looked at her as if seeing her for the first time, as if the bruises weren't the only thing healing. But he said nothing, just nodded and returned to his seat by the fire. She sat across from him, the firelight dancing in her eyes. A silence stretched between them, but it was a different silence now. Not the silence of fear, but the quiet of something blooming, unspoken, hopeful, still unnamed. And in that quiet, Alara breathed easier. Her hands stopped trembling when she reached for the cradle. For the first time in years, she didn't feel like she was just surviving in someone else's shadow. She was building something here, something not yet spoken, but real. Jack watched her from across the room, his eyes calm, as if waiting for her to come back to herself, in her own time. Outside, snow flurried against the window, but inside the fire kept burning, and the silence was warm. The season turned in whispers. Winter's grip loosened slowly, not with fanfare but with subtle signs. The distant chirp of a returning bird, the drip of thawing ice from the roof, the faint scent of pine needles beneath the melt. The cabin, once buried in snow, now had patches of earth appearing like freckles on its shoulders. Life was coming back, slowly and hesitantly, like someone walking home after a long exile. Inside, the girls grew stronger. They babbled now, small mouths forming sounds that weren't quite words, but were full of purpose. Alara's days passed in a rhythm of rocking, feeding and folding. Her hands were steadier, her steps more confident. She wore her hair differently now, tied loosely with the faded ribbon Jack had brought from town. Her cheeks had color, and when she smiled, it lingered. Jack had started carving things. At first it was little wooden animals for the girls. Bears, rabbits, a horse with a crooked tail. But one morning, Alara saw him sitting on the porch, chiseling something longer, slower, a cradle, larger than the makeshift one in the cabin. Shaped with care, smoothed at every corner, and lined with small notches, like tally marks, counting each day she'd stayed. He didn't show it to her. He simply left it beside the fire one night without a word. She ran her hand over it, marveling at the feel of his effort. He never asked if she liked it, and she never said thank you. Some things were too deep for words. Then 3 riders came up the trail. She saw them first, standing at the kitchen window, with a cloth in her hands. 3 figures on horseback, shadowed by the morning fog. One wore a brown coat. She remembered well, her brother-in-law, a man named Silas. The others cousins, rough men with scarred hands and colder eyes, all carrying rifles. She dropped the cloth, her hands trembling. The twins stirred in their cradle. Jack stepped onto the porch before they reached the gate.
He didn't take his rifle,
just leaned against the post, his arms crossed. The men halted 10 paces away. Silas spat into the dirt. "That woman in there belongs to my family, and those girls carry our blood." Jack didn't move. "That may be so." Silas's jaw worked. "We don't want no trouble. We just came to take back what's ours." Jack's voice was calm as morning frost. "She's not yours. She's not a possession to claim. She was married to my brother Alaric, and those children have his last name." "Then your brother should have stayed alive," Jack replied. A tense silence. One of the cousins shifted in his saddle, the other clicked the hammer of his rifle. "I don't want to see this go ugly," Silas warned. Jack stared at him, with the same quiet steadiness Alara had come to know. "Neither do I." Another pause. Then Jack straightened from the post and walked toward them. No gun, no anger, just steps heavy with intent. "You ride down this hill now," he said softly, "or I bury 3 more men before supper." The wind blew, thin and dry. Silas hesitated, looking toward the cabin window, where he saw Alara staring back. His lips curled. "She ain't worth it, rancher. Women like her, they ruin good men." Jack didn't blink. "She's still more woman than you'll ever be a man." That did it. Silas yanked his reins, and turned. The cousins followed, 3 dark silhouettes, swallowed slowly by the mist and trees. Jack watched them go, then returned to the porch. He stood silent for a long moment before coming inside. Alara hadn't moved from the window. Her breath fogged the glass, and her arms shivered. "They'll bring more next time," she said quietly. She nodded, then fell silent. That night she couldn't sleep. She sat in the rocker long after the twins drifted off, her fingers twisting the hem of her dress. The fire snapped. Outside the wind had changed direction. Jack sat on the floor by the hearth, sharpening his blade. "I don't belong anywhere," she said quietly. "You belong here." She looked down. "I've never belonged anywhere," she whispered. "Not with my husband, not in his family's house. I was just something to marry, something to carry children. That's all." Jack stood and poured warm water into her cup. "You're not something," he said. "You're someone." She took the cup with shaking hands, sipped and closed her eyes. "I'm tired of running." "Then stop," he said, his voice so simple and sure it felt like a truth the earth had known long before her. "I don't know how." He crouched beside her, one knee on the floor, one hand on the edge of the cradle. "You stay, that's how." Her breath caught. She turned to him slowly, her eyes shimmering, not with tears, but with something older and raw, a nameless yearning. Jack didn't reach for her, he just sat there beside her, grounded as a stone. She touched his hand. Their fingers didn't clasp, just a light touch, yet the weight of it knocked the air from her lungs. For the first time since her marriage, since her husband's death, since the rope burns faded from her wrists, she felt seen, truly, silently, fully seen. Next morning she heard the knock. Not on the cabin door, but on her heart. A letter had come, delivered by a red-faced clerk on a stubborn mule, a distant cousin from her mother's side, one of the few blood ties that hadn't vanished, had offered her a place, a house, A maid. A claim of inheritance from a forgotten grandfather's estate. Comfort. A room of her own. A new name for the girls. A start without Jack. She held the letter in her hands like it might burst into flames. Jack didn't react when she showed him. He just read it once, folded it, and handed it back with a nod. His eyes didn't falter, though they turned quieter than usual. He didn't ask her to stay. He just went outside and began saddling her horse. By noon, her bag was packed. She sat with it on the porch beside the cradle, watching the sun stripe the trees. The girls napped beside her, one thumb in her mouth, the other curled into a fist as if ready to take on the world. Jack came from the barn and placed a parcel beside her: cheese, bread, water, a spare wool blanket. He didn't sit, just nodded again. "You'll be all right," he said. She blinked slowly. "And you?" He looked toward the distant ridge. "I was all right before." She flinched, not at the words, but at the kindness he still managed to speak them with. "You're not going to stop me?" He shook his head once. "Never was my place." She stared down at the babies. "They like it here. They'll like wherever you are." She stood, her legs feeling heavy. Each step was an effort, as if her bones knew something her heart hadn't caught up with. At the edge of the porch she turned back.
"Hey.
"Do you want me to go?" He met her gaze, and this time something cracked in his face. Not weakness, but a raw, honest truth. "I want you to stay," he said, "but only if it's what you want to." Her throat tightened. "And if I do, I'll build you a life," he whispered. "A quiet one. One you don't have to survive." Her knees nearly gave way. Jack looked down at the girls. "You've got daughters that need a man who'll watch over them like sunrise and supper. And I've got hands that ain't done nothing good until you put them to work." She laughed through her tears. He stepped toward her, for the first time not with stillness, but with a fire in his chest. A fire that didn't burn. It warmed. "I don't have a ring," he said, "but I've got a home that knows your name, and a fire that waits for your hands to stoke it. That's what I can give you." She dropped her bag. The sound was soft but final. Then her face crumpled, not in sorrow, but in surrender. To help, to safety, to him. When Jack reached out, she didn't flinch. She walked into his arms like a woman who finally believed she deserved to be there. He held her like she'd never been held. Not tight, but full and present. He was making space for every part of her. The broken bits, the strong bits, the parts still learning how to breathe. The girls stirred in the cradle, blinking up at the world with the wide eyes of children who didn't yet know that people leave. But this time no one left. The wedding happened 3 days later. Martha Caldwell came, half in protest, half in curiosity. She brought pickled beets and a look that said, "I told you so," even though she hadn't. The preacher was old and hard of hearing. He asked Alara to speak louder twice, and she did, her voice trembling, but finally knowing what it meant to make a promise. Jack said nothing fancy. He just looked at her like she was the only thing that made sense and murmured, "I choose you, every day, even the hard ones." The girls squealed, and the pine trees bowed slightly in the breeze. That night, they sat on the porch beneath a sky littered with stars. Jack had taken off his boots and leaned back against the railing, legs stretched out, hands behind his head. Alara sat cross-legged beside him, one baby asleep in her lap, the other curled at her feet. Neither spoke for a long while. Then Jack said, "You never told me what you wanted, not once." She looked over at him. "That's because no one ever asked." She smiled. "I want days that aren't loud. I want bread that rises. And I want girls who don't learn to shrink. I want a man who doesn't make me earn safety." He nodded. "Then that's what we'll build." She leaned her head on his shoulder. The fire inside the cabin burned low but steady. Somewhere far off, a coyote howled, and got no answer. Here in this small corner of a wide and lonesome world, the silence held no sorrow anymore. Only peace, only warmth, only the sound of 2 daughters breathing softly beside 2 people who had finally found what they never dared to ask for: a home that stayed. Thanks for riding with us, friend. Watch the next Sleep West story right here on your screen and join us on the trail.